I want to, because obviously the whole reason I reached out to you in the first place was geothermal, and I want to explain to you my understanding of the potential and promise of geothermal, and then have you either critique it or agree with it. Okay?
Sure.
So, as I understand it, the world is the planet Earth is essentially a nuclear reactor. We have functionally infinite heat coming from the core of the world. I say functionally because it's got maybe a billion-year lifespan or whatever. We're not going to be here in a billion years. So functionally infinite heat coming from the core of the Earth, and then the soil, the crust that we live on is like a thin like film that would be on top of, say, a hot glass of milk. Essentially, it's that thin and fragile in the context of the entire planet. And so therefore we have this heat coming from the center up into the surface, and just say 20, 30, 15, 20, 30 kilometers below our feet, there are pockets around the Earth that have extremely hot quartz between 200, 300 Celsius, más o menos. And so therefore, if you have the heat from the center of the Earth heating up these rocks, theoretically, all you'd want to do is capture some of that energy and then bring it to the surface. And how would we do that? We dig deep enough into this extremely hot quartz. That requires a engineering innovation that we currently, actually I figured out the other day, I think we might have, so we'll talk about that as well. But just for the sake of it, we don't have, which is a drill that can sustain the heat and drill into a rock this bad. Frack it, throw some water into it. The steam that comes up is then captured in a turbine, and there you go. We've created electricity that is functionally green, perfectly green. There's obviously going to be second, third, and fourth order effects that we can't predict, but nonetheless, just for the sake of it, functionally green and functionally infinite, which means if it's done at a big enough scale, the promise of geothermal energy in places like north of Cooper Pedy in Australia, Iceland, pockets of Sweden, a massive rock here in Mexico, it could potentially solve the energy problem. The one thing that we have working against us is this innovation of engineering, and that's how I understand geothermal. Now, I take it with a pinch of salt when someone says, here's the solution, but that's how I see things. What do you reckon?
I would just make a few amendments, because there's actually three different kinds of geothermal. Traditional geothermal works with these sort of natural geothermal fields where there's a natural sort of feature, a dome of hard rock that traps a pocket of basically superheated water. And that's what traditional geothermal has been. That's what most geothermal
That's like
power
hot springs that we have around the world, natural hot springs.
Is today. Yeah, they're in those areas, but those are geographically confined. Mm-hmm. There's only a limited number of kind of those areas in the world, hydrothermal areas where the sort of heat and water are getting trapped in very convenient pockets. Mm-hmm. So that's one kind. The promise for advanced geothermal is the rock itself down deep enough is hot. So the idea is you can take hydraulic fracturing, which was developed for fracking natural gas, go down into just that very, very, very deep. This is all much deeper, right? Because everything, you get down deep enough, everything's hot, right?
How deep?
So you get down deep enough.
How deep?
Oh, I couldn't tell you without looking up the.
But am I in the 15, 30 kilometer range?
Yes, like miles. And this is why you need these special drill bits, and because because oil and gas has perfected a lot about drilling, but they don't really need to go into these hot areas. So oil and gas has never really perfected the technique of drilling in super, super hot rocks. So that's what a lot of the innovation is going on. But you go down into that super, super hot rock, you jam water down there and fracture the rocks. You just create these cracks in the rocks, and then the water superheats and you pump it back up. So the beauty of advanced geothermal is you're not geographically limited, right? You can do that anywhere in the world. And if you can get down deep enough where it's super, super hot, you can make really cheap electricity out of it. Like the hotter it gets, the cheaper the electricity will be. So, but I would caution a little bit against the idea that it's infinite. I think you can tap out local, like you're not going to extinguish the Earth's core, obviously, but you can tap out local heat in a geographic area. So I don't think it's like there are reasons to think it's not.
Can you?
It's not infinite. It could play a big
expand
role.
on that point a bit. Why would it tap out?
Just because I think you drain enough heat out of the rock. You drain it faster than it's being
replenished,
restored, basically.
Okay.
Yeah. So you just have to moderate how much you take out. But the third form of geothermal, which is actually the oldest, centuries and centuries old, is instead of using the heat to boil water and make steam and turn a turbine and make electricity, you just use the heat directly to heat your house or your village or whatever. And I think like the oldest, what do they say? The oldest community geothermal system was built in, I think, the 1700s or something. So like this is something people have been doing for a long time. They realize we need heat in our homes. So it's much warmer 20, 30 feet down. So let's just go get some of that warmth. Yep. And the beauty of that, these are called ground source heat pumps. And the beauty of that is you're not creating the heat. You're just harvesting it. You're just going down and harvesting it and bringing it back up. So it's super, super, super efficient once you've got it built. But it is on an upfront capital cost basis. It's much more expensive than other options up front. This is like so many, this, by the way, just as an aside, is a feature of so many clean technologies. Over their lifetime, they're already cheaper, but they have much higher upfront capital costs. So a huge piece of clean energy innovation is finance innovation, is figuring out a way to finance these things, new tools to finance these things. The same way we sort of dreamed up the 30-year fixed mortgage for homes and unlocked home ownership for millions of Americans, we need to create new financial instruments like that to help fund some of these things that are expensive up front, but cheap in the long term. So geothermal electricity and geothermal heat. And then of the electricity, there's the geographically confined, tapping into existing geothermal features. And then there's geothermal anywhere, which is super, super deep. And that's where the sort of super sexy, cutting edge innovation is happening right now, is figuring out how to get super, super deep. Just stuff like, how do you get a drill bit that won't melt? How do you get like tubes and and electronic components that won't melt in that heat? It's all new. So there's a lot of interesting work going on there. I don't know if you saw recently, Google signed a deal with a cutting edge geothermal company called Fervo.
No, I didn't see that.
Because Google is trying not just to buy as much clean energy as the energy they use, which is the sort of standard way of saying you're zero emissions. Google is actually trying to match the clean energy to its usage in real time, so that it's literally using clean electrons throughout the day, which is a way more complicated and difficult task. So it's been, it's got its Google X or whatever its innovation arm is, looking around now for all these energy options, and it just signed a big deal with a geothermal company. And so geothermal has kind of lagged in the last until about 5 years ago, and then there's just been a boom, an absolute boom. It's super exciting to be following right now.
Super exciting.
And part of the boom, while I think of it before I forget it, and one of the interesting things about the boom, one of the reasons this has drawn so much interest and intrigue is that oil and gas is going through a rough period, you might have noticed. And if we get our shit together to reduce emissions the way we need to, is going to go through a much rougher period. And so you're going to have all these highly trained, super smart engineers out of work. And it turns out that what they're good at is drilling. So like, here is a way for oil and gas people who want to like spend their lives doing something better to put their exact skills to work in cutting edge zero carbon energy, which is really cool.
Yeah, it is really cool. In Stockholm, the geothermal heat just from the shallow grounds, it's where I live, Stockholm. I didn't realize, but my building was heated by this, right? And
Yeah, it's very big. It's very big in Europe,
yeah,
and especially in some like northern European cities. And the coolest thing you can do is build one giant well, geothermal well, to tap the heat, and then just run tubing throughout your city, like it's like any other sort of city infrastructure, like sewer pipes or electrical lines or whatever. You just lay down geothermal piping, and you can heat your entire city from this one well. And if you can do that, it is by far the cheapest way to heat
Yeah.
a city, like by head and shoulders. It's just, again,
it's the upfront
super
cost.
expensive up front.
Which
Yeah.
is why there's a suburb in Stockholm called Danderyd, which is the rich man suburb, and basically all the houses there have their own geothermal heating. And I saw it. It was very cool, especially once the architects get involved. You can make it beautiful, like it almost feels like your house is a part of the earth. But
yes, and it's
upfront
steady
costs,
heat,
so
and it's like it's comfortable too. It's a good, comfortable heat. I mean, it's just a matter of finding social organizations, whether it's city governments or whatever, that can think ahead and plan somewhat comprehensively, which is not, we're not great at that in the U.S. either. But like,
politicians around the world
you need
aren't
to
good
do
at that.
this. You need to do this. I mean, at the very least, at the very baseline minimum, we need to be doing this for all new developments, all new neighborhoods, all new cities or developments need to be geothermally heated. That should be law. Because once you do it, it's like anything else. Once you do it enough times, it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Like, we just haven't had the scale for this to really bring down costs the way they could. So, somebody just needs to sort of bite the bullet and pay those upfront costs to start that down the cost curve.
Yeah. Can you speak, you mentioned this company Fervo. Could you speak a little bit more about exciting companies in this space that you see and exciting innovations?
Well, a couple of different technologies are interesting. One is, so right now, the standard is to pump the water down into the rock, fracture the rock, and then try to gather the water back up and bring it back up. There is a company that I can't remember its name off the top of my head, and I don't want to get it wrong while I'm talking to you. But there's a company that's doing what's called closed loop. So the idea is you just have like a fancy version of PVC pipe that goes all the way down, then laterally through the rock, and then all the way back up. So no water is ever released into, to get contaminated or to pick up chemicals or to anything else. There's zero sort of interaction between the geothermal well and the ground. It just heats the water and brings it back up. So you end up with superheated water without any of the dangers of contamination or anything else. That company is getting tons of hype and tons of investment, even though I can't remember the name now. I'm gonna find it for you though.
So the PVC pipe goes into the well, runs across, and then runs back up, and they just pour water in here, and it comes out as gas here. Then the water's recaptured, and it goes back in. That cycle.
Yes, it's called Eavor, EAVOR. It's actually a Canadian company. It's
EAVOR. Evil.
EAVOR. Because right now, all ground source heat pumps, there's the sort of small, like residential sized, those are all closed loop, right? The idea is just blowing that out into a truly massive, going down thousands of meters and across thousands of meters, making that work. And part of what's, I mentioned this before, but part of what's enabling a lot of this is natural gas technology innovations. Fracturing of solid rock comes out of the natural gas world, and lateral drilling was a huge piece of what enabled the fracking revolution. And that is also coming in extremely handy. So Eavor, sinks a pipe down and then lateral drills 2,000 meters across and then brings the pipe back up.
Wow.
So for that whole, 2,000 meters, the water is just picking up heat. So it's going to be interesting in retrospect to see how much of this flows out of fossil fuel innovations. But there are a ton of there's a ton of companies that haven't even kind of reached have reached demonstration, but don't even have a commercial plant open yet. Like there's tons of, especially lately, there's tons of early stage
exploratory companies and stuff.
Just exploring, doing like lab work and engineering testing, and it's a really fun. Like if you're an engineering minded person, this is just super fun. Area to be in right now.
Are you familiar with Robert Friedland and iPulse?
No.
It'd be interesting for you. He's a Canadian billionaire, made his money in copper mostly. He has the largest copper mine in the world. But this company, iPulse, are a drill tech company, and they're looking to tap this Mexican quartz that I mentioned earlier.
Well, yeah, interesting new ways of drilling are a huge piece of this. You think you just need a super hard drill head, but there are people using pulses of sound waves. Maybe that might be what you're referring to. There are people using lasers, drilling with lasers. Like it's much easier if you can figure out a way to do it that doesn't require a physical, thing jamming up against the rock. Like you're going to last a lot longer. Yep. So there's lots of stuff like that going on. The two other companies I meant to mention are Green Fire Energy is a startup, and Sage Geosystems. Both of those are kind of early startup, cutting edge. Overwhelmingly likely that most of these early companies will fail. It's just there's gonna be one that doesn't eventually.
That's exactly right. But all you need is the one to stumble across the right tech. They can patent it, make trillions of dollars, but as long as the rest of us can reproduce it, that's all that matters.
Yeah, and not just the right tech again, but like the right financing, like the right public policy, like all the pieces have to come together. Like this is what's been going on in geothermal. Is like the pieces haven't been quite lining up, but now we have like the need, the policy, the engineers, it's all. I think it's all.
You know where it's going to come from, man?